When Dr. Sigmund Freud began asking his patients about their dreams, his colleagues in Vienna thought he was a crackpot. But Freud followed those dreams to their roots in the unconscious, and in so doing, he more or less invented modern psychiatry. Freud himself had a bundle of neuroses, and many of his most disturbing and revolutionary insights began with his own self-analysis. In a moment, the extraordinary life and psyche of Sigmund Freud.
In 1938, at the age of 81, Sigmund Freud, the father of modern psychiatry, recorded a brief statement about his life and career, the only recording he ever made.
I started my professional activity trying to bring relief to my neurotic patients. I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious.
He found in the repressed areas of the mind what had been banished from conscious thought: fantasies of incest, fantasies of murder, repressed hatreds.
He is pushing sexuality back to a period when most people thought children were innocent, and extending the whole notion of what do we mean by sexual.
His reputation was that he was a libertine. He wrote pornographic materials, that he was a dirty, filthy, a disgusting person.
People did not believe in my facts and thought my theories unsavory. In the end, I succeeded, but the struggle is not yet over. Sigmund Freud.
Sigismund Shlomo Freud was born on May 6, 1856, in the tiny Moravian village of Freiburg, about 100 miles north of the Austro-Hungarian capital of Vienna. His father, Jacob, was a Jewish wool merchant who could barely make ends meet in a hostile and at times dangerously anti-Semitic environment. Jacob was 42 years old when Sigmund was born, 20 years older than his third wife, Amalie. The family, which lived in a single room and included 2 adult half-brothers, was a confusing place to grow up in.
He's got 2 half-brothers that basically look like they're old enough to be fathers and husbands to his mother. He's got a father who's old enough to look like his grandfather. So there must have been a tremendous, tremendous puzzle to Freud to figure out who belongs to whom.
The puzzle got worse when Freud was 2 and his mother had a second son, Julius, who died 6 months later.
The experience of birth and death under very close circumstances must have been not only disturbing, but stimulating, even overstimulating for the child.
Young Sigismund was named after a legendary Moravian emperor. Born with thick black hair, an old peasant woman said he was destined for future greatness. My golden Siggy, his mother called him. In 1860, the Freuds moved to Vienna, a grand European capital with a crowded Jewish ghetto. The family was growing. By the time he was 10, Sigmund had 5 sisters and a brother, but the golden child was still getting special treatment.
Freud was the only person in the family who had his own room where he could study, read. When one of his sisters started to take up the piano, she reported that the noise disturbed Freud. As a result of his complaint, the piano was removed, which gives you some indication of this very special position.
Freud justified his position by earning top marks at his Jewish grade school and by studying languages on his own. By the time he was 12, he was reading Shakespeare in the original and was fluent in 6 languages. He studied obsessively, taking meals in his room to save time. And he developed an unusual hobby.
he had kept a boyhood record of his dreams. So here we have the future interpreter of dreams as a boy writing down his dreams and keeping a record of them. This interest in dreams and fantasy life was obviously something that he developed very early, and I think it's quite unusual.
Freud's dreams were unusually heroic. At the age of 10, he named his baby brother Alexander in honor of Alexander the Great. He identified with Napoleon, and he bristled at the humiliating anti-Semitism of Vienna, which gave his ambition a combative edge.
When Freud is a preteen, his father tells him how he had walked down the street and how a non-Jew had come over to him and said, "Jew, get off the pavement," and knocked his hat off. And Freud asked his father, "What did you do?" And his father said, "Well, I just got off, and picked up my hat and walked on." Freud felt this as a terribly humiliating position to have taken.
He vowed that he would behave differently if and when he was attacked, physically or otherwise. And he was certain that he would one day make a name for himself on his terms.
He told a young playmate in letters when he was an adolescent, "Save these letters. You never know how important they will be." You never know, he said.
In 1873, Freud entered medical school at the University of Vienna. While still a student, he did important research on the sexual organs of eels. He dissected over 400, and the nervous systems of fish, which he illustrated in a letter to a friend. Freud wanted to become a research scientist, but there was a quota for Jews in that prestigious field. Reluctantly, and in order to make a living, he decided to become a doctor. He was anxious to make a living because he had fallen in love with a friend of his sister's, 20-year-old Martha Bernays. Freud, 25, was both passionate and shy, and the romance was intensely Victorian.
It's a classically Victorian love affair where most of it took place by correspondence, and I think at one point when he asked her to marry him, she squeezed his hand under the table, so it was all very, very proper.
I mean, the young man, Freud, was inexperienced with women. And I think Martha was going to be the princess and preside, and he would be her knight errant.
The engagement lasted 4 years, an ordeal of abstinence, during which Freud saw Martha, who lived in Germany with her mother, just 6 times. He wrote her over 900 intensely romantic letters, addressing her as "my beloved princess" and "my dearest treasure." One letter included an ink blot, a Freudian ink blot.
Here the pen fell out of the writer's hand and wrote this secret sign. Please forgive, and don't ask for an interpretation.
The long engagement made Freud impatient for professional success, and in 1884 he began researching a new drug that he thought might win him fame. The drug was cocaine.
He was looking for the lucky hit, and he had heard about the therapeutic effects of cocaine, I think, with Austrian soldiers, and decided to experiment with it on himself and with a colleague of his, and very, very hastily started really advocating in published form the use of cocaine as a therapeutic adjunct. He was unaware that it had an addictive property.
Indeed, Freud was taking liberal doses of cocaine, and even sending an occasional half-gram to Martha, to be divided into 5 large or 8 small doses, as he instructed. As for himself, Freud promised that the next time she saw him, he would be a big, wild man with cocaine in his body.
I think Freud really took up the advocacy of cocaine because, first of all, first and primary, it had such a wonderful effect on him. I think if anyone's ever seen pictures of Freud, they see him as a kind of a depressed, morose-looking individual, and certainly the euphoric qualities of cocaine lifted his spirits.
Unfortunately, Freud's cocaine experiments ended in disaster. Naively enthusiastic, impatient for his own success, he prescribed the drug to a close friend, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxau, in hopes of weaning him from an agonizing morphine addiction. Instead, Fleischl-Marxau developed a fatal addiction to cocaine. To make matters worse, another friend and fellow scientist, Karl Kohler, following Freud's own leads, discovered that cocaine could be used as an anesthetic for surgery of the eye. He, and not Freud, became famous overnight. Despite these experiences and the black eye they gave him in professional circles, Freud continued to use cocaine as a pick-me-up until 1895.
One of the things that made him blind to its negative properties was the fact that he really only used it intermittently and never became addicted to it. What he was really addicted to was his work.
In 1885, Sigmund Freud was an unknown intern at the General Hospital of Vienna. His specialty was nervous diseases, a field that included hysteria and other eccentric disorders. But Freud chose it for strictly practical reasons. He was in a hurry to marry, and there were few doctors in the field. Mental illness was the backwater of 19th century medicine, both in terms of understanding and treatment.
Before Freud, people were spun around in chairs that made them dizzy. People were doused with cold water. People were forced to wear chains.
The most enlightened doctors of the day assumed that hysteria and related ailments were at root physical, caused by nerve damage or a lesion on the brain. Freud shared that view when he went to Paris in 1885 to study with one of the world's authorities on nervous disorders, a charismatic Frenchman, Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot was conducting odd but fascinating experiments, putting hysterical patients under hypnosis, experiments that turned Freud's ideas inside out and launched him on a lifelong exploration of the psyche.
Diseases can be caused by ideas. That's what he got from Charcot. Charcot hypnotized people, and Charcot proved that you can implant ideas into someone in a hypnotic state and produced a physical symptom.
The key idea in Charcot was that it could be that their beliefs in some layer of the mind that figure very strongly in the kind of symptoms that the hysterics showed at the time. In other words, it's not just in the body, it's also in the mind.
More specifically, a hidden part of the mind, what Charcot called the second mind, and what Freud eventually turned into the unconscious, one of the defining concepts of the 20th century. On April 5, 1886, just weeks after returning from Paris, Freud opened his own medical practice, renting a one-room office on the fringe of fashionable Vienna. He struggled to make ends meet, and sometimes couldn't afford cab fare for a house call. Freud began his medical practice as a hypnotist. The famous Freudian couch comes from hypnosis. It was easier to put someone in a trance lying down. Inspired by Charcot, Freud hoped to get into his patients' second mind and end their hysteria through hypnotic suggestion. It didn't really work, but it was no less effective than the other therapies of the time, some of which Freud also employed.
He tried the usual barrage of therapeutic remedies, the spa cures, they had electrotherapy, they had hydrotherapy, even the use of magnets. Freud was what was called a magnetizer, where he would practice on patients transferring symptoms from one side of the body to the other.
None of it worked, and Freud was increasingly fascinated with the problem of why. He picked up a crucial clue from a colleague, Dr. Joseph Breuer. Breuer told Freud about an unusual patient, known in psychoanalytic history as Anna O, and an even more unusual treatment, the talking cure.
Anna O is a very severe hysteric. She has contractures, she has paralyses, she has impairment of vision and speech, and Breuer starts to see her daily, and as she describes her symptoms, he becomes aware of the fact that when she tells him about the origin of a symptom, the symptom tends to disappear. It is the patient who coins the term the talking treatment, which becomes the basis of all psychotherapy.
Still using hypnosis, Freud adopted this eccentric new treatment, talking with his patients about their symptoms, trying to uncover when and how they began. What he uncovered is still reverberating through Western culture. Patient after patient traced their hysteria back to traumatic childhood experiences involving sex. Sex, it seemed, was at the root of neurotic sickness. For a time, Freud believed that all hysteria stemmed from childhood sexual abuse. Eventually, he argued that it either came from real abuse or from a repressed and guilty childhood fantasy of sex. In either case, sex was at the core of the problem. In fact, sex was cropping up everywhere, even Freud's consulting room. His female patients, one after the next, were developing romantic feelings for their doctor. At the end of one session, a woman threw her arms around Freud and gave him a passionate kiss. Freud was highly aroused, as a scientist, and he pondered this new riddle.
Here he was, roughly 40, sexually inexperienced, and all of a sudden he's with a woman patient who throws her arms around him and wants a kiss. Now, I think that many men in that circumstance might think, the patient finds me attractive. She has fallen in love with me. But Freud didn't. Here he was in a sexually saturated clinical setting, and he was not going to succumb to the sexuality, nor was he going to leave it. He was going to figure out a way how to stay there and work with the patient.
Freud eventually realized that his patients were transferring passionate feelings for their parents onto him. The concept of transference became a crucial tool in psychotherapy. Ironically, while Freud's work life was saturated with issues of sex, his actual sex life was dwindling and threatening to make him neurotic. He married Martha at the age of 30 in 1886, and the two had 6 children in the next 8 years. Freud wanted no more offspring, but he detested birth control, especially the then prevalent withdrawal method. His numerous male patients convinced him it was the primary cause of neurotic anxiety in men.
He said in the 1890s, the only way in which a man cannot be neurotic is to have free and unfettered sexual intercourse with his mate, which meant no condoms, meant no coitus interruptus, it meant no masturbation. You know, if you did any of those things, you were going to wind up being neurotic.
After the birth of Anna in 1895, Freud, the man who made libido a household word and singled out sex as a primary force in the human psyche, gave up sex for a number of years.
Freud talked about libido, and I don't think early on one would say that he had a low libido. You could say, I mean, one has a sense maybe he pooed out early, or that he sublimated it very well. And I think that he allowed for people to sublimate in their work, and he was passionately involved in his work.
Increasingly, for Freud, work was his passion. The ambitious golden boy was caught up in the scientific sleuthing of a lifetime, piecing together revolutionary ideas about dreams, the unconscious, and sexuality into a radical new conception of the mind.
A man like me cannot live without a hobby horse, a consuming passion, a tyrant. I have found my tyrant, and in his service I know no limits. My tyrant is psychology. Sigmund Freud.
By the 1890s, Sigmund Freud was successful enough with his peculiar talking treatment to open new offices in a fashionable district of Vienna. The address was Bergasse 19, and Freud would live and work here for 47 years. On October 23, 1896, Sigmund Freud's father, Jacob, died. Overcome with painful and confusing feelings, Freud, 40 years old, decided to analyze himself. Freud's self-analysis, his voyage into his own unconscious, is a legendary, almost mythical moment in the history of psychiatry.
What Freud did was what no other human being had ever accomplished. The self-analysis was a monumental achievement, and Freud was the first person to be able to lift his own defenses, overcome his own resistance, and interpret his own unconscious.
Freud had recently discovered what he called the royal road to the unconscious, dreams, and he had developed an odd but intriguing new method for exploring that road, free association, paying attention to anything that came to mind without any censorship. Every night after his patients, Freud put himself on the couch and free associated around his dreams. One dream produced a vivid and suggestive image, Freud dissecting himself from the hips down. Freud certainly had plenty of neuroses to dissect. Among other things, he had a travel phobia. He longed to visit Rome and once went within 50 miles of the city, then turned around and went home. He also had a tendency to faint in the presence of talented male friends, and he had a severe addiction to cigars.
Some sad secrets of life are being traced back to their first roots. I am now experiencing myself all the things that as a third party I have witnessed in my patients. Days when I slink about depressed because I have understood nothing of the day's dreams, fantasies or moods, and other days when a flash of lightning brings coherence.
At first, for about a year, the process of self-analysis made his symptoms worse because he was really looking into what he called the dung heap, which meant all of the disgraceful or shameful or anxiety-producing feelings that were swept into the unconscious.
Fantasies of incest, fantasies of murder, unacceptable forms of rivalry, repressed hatreds.
The fact that as a child he could wish for the death of a brother, the fact that he could, as a child, lust for his mother. To really face the fact that a child had sexual feelings and could have them for a parent, that was so radical in his time.
Lust for the mother, hatred of the father. As an infant, incredible, impossible feelings to uncover in oneself, especially in 1896. But Freud looked at these memories like a scientist looking at research, without moral judgment, and he made a breathtaking leap. What if all children universally experienced passionate feelings of love and hate toward their parents? What if those feelings were built into the very process of human development? The Oedipus complex is the name Freud eventually bestowed on this hot bundle of infantile passion. The name is taken from the play by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, in which Oedipus, king of Thebes, unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother.
His destiny moves us because it might have been ours. It is the fate of all of us, perhaps to direct our first sexual impulse towards our mother, and our first hatred and murderous wish against our father. Our dreams convince us that that is so. Sigmund Freud.
Freud's ideas, not surprisingly, were greeted with derision.
His reputation was that he was a libertine, that he wrote pornographic materials, that he was a dirty, filthy, disgusting person.
Well, there was, of course, a lot of jealousy and resentment against his theories. If you tell people that your son wants to marry his mother, this is resented by many fathers.
Freud's self-analysis lasted 4 years. He did not manage to cure himself of every neurosis, but he did overcome his travel phobia. In 1901, he made the first of many trips to Rome. More importantly, Freud, drawing largely from his own memories and dreams, wrote what he regarded as his most important work, The Interpretation of Dreams. In effect, a record of his self-analysis. The book was published in 1899, but Freud had the publisher mark the date as 1900. He wanted it to usher in the 20th century. No one noticed. The Dream Book, containing ideas that would shape the modern era, sold just 300 copies in 6 years. By 1900, Sigmund Freud had pieced together a handful of dazzling insights into what he viewed as nothing less than a new science, the science of psychoanalysis. Freud's primary aim was now to establish psychoanalysis in the world, to develop it into an international movement. His biggest fear was that anti-Semitism would get in the way, that analysis would be dismissed as a Jewish science. Certainly, only Jews showed any interest in Freud at the turn of the century. By 1902, he had attracted a small circle of followers, all of them Jewish, and they began to meet every Wednesday in Freud's waiting room, forming what became known as the Wednesday Society. The subject of their first gathering was one dear to Freud, the significance of smoking cigars. Freud himself was now smoking between 20 and 25 a day. Another interesting topic might well have been doodles, specifically Freud's doodles, unconscious images and signs like these, which he liked to scratch out during society meetings. Freud continued to write during these years, and he had surprising popular success with a book that illustrated the unconscious with examples from everyday life, and that introduced his most famous idea, the Freudian slip.
Dreams, slips, which now we all think of as Freudian slips, and jokes. I mean, is this the stuff of which serious science was to be made? He turned it into that. But that was a remarkable performance.
I was fully aware of grandfather's ideas. I mean, Freudian slips, for instance. If you meet somebody and say goodbye, you rather not meet him.
Someone Freud was eager to meet was Carl Jung, a brilliant Swiss psychiatrist who had taken up Freud's ideas, and whom Freud came to regard as his most gifted follower. What made Jung really special, however, had nothing to do with his ideas.
The only non-Jew in grandfather's circle was Jung, and that's the reason why grandfather applauded him so much at the beginning. At long last, we are recognized by the others as well.
A turning point in recognition by the others came in 1909, when Freud was invited to America to give a series of lectures at Clark University and to receive an honorary degree.
It seemed like the realization of some incredible daydream. Psychoanalysis was no longer the product of delusion. It had become a valuable part of reality. Sigmund Freud.
Still, the future of psychoanalysis was anything but secure. Freud's most famous protégés, including Jung, began to differ with him on key points. Freud, the father figure of the movement, would not tolerate this kind of rebellion.
He demanded absolute loyalty. And if that wasn't forthcoming, well, then he cut his ties.
Freud's relationship with Jung, whom he called his beloved son, became especially tense. 3 times Freud fainted in Jung's presence, responding to what he sensed was a murderous wish from Jung. The two broke bitterly in 1914 and never spoke again. To ward off future betrayals, Freud formed a secret committee of loyal adherents. They would fight for and protect Freud's core ideas, and they swore allegiance to Freud by wearing rings that he made from a Grecian gem. World War I was a turning point for Freud no less than the world. The slaughter confirmed his worst ideas about the dark side of the unconscious and the psychology of human beings.
World War I
frightened Freud tremendously. First of all, you have to remember that all three of his sons were enlisted in the Austrian army. Meanwhile, he's hearing of hundreds and thousands of people being killed in these battles, and certainly I think the impact of these kinds of forces made him look through a glass darkly at man's aggressive potential, because before him he saw it realized.
The war hit Freud hard on a personal as well as philosophical level. He spent the winters shivering in his unheated study trying to work. Things got so bad that Freud demanded to be paid for one piece of writing in potatoes. Hard times continued after the war. Freud's favorite daughter, Sophie, died of malnutrition and pneumonia in 1920. 6 weeks after her death, he published one of his darkest and most controversial works, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. In it, Freud argued that there is a drive in humans beyond libido, an aggressive drive, a death drive.
He developed his two-part theory of eros and thanatos. Thanatos being the aggressive, the destructive drive, which he then posited as just as instinctive a part of the human being as eros, the loving, constructive drive.
He now starts to posit after the First War the death instinct, that man has a primary need to destroy himself if left unfettered.
Another blow came in 1923 when Freud developed a cancerous tumor in his mouth and had to have a large piece of his jaw removed, the first of 33 surgeries in 16 years. Freud had to wear a prosthesis so large it was called the monster, separating his sinus from his jaw. Excruciatingly painful, it had to be removed and cleaned every day, and a special room at Bergasse 19 was prepared for these operations.
Grandfather suffered from cancer in the mouth, which very much influenced his life. He had difficulties speaking, he had difficulties eating. It made him more detached. I mean, you wouldn't go and sit on his knee, for instance.
Despite the cancer, Freud could not break his addiction to cigars, an astonishing failure by the most famous therapist in the world.
He said that he needed to smoke in order to be productive and creative. So I guess that was more important to him than healing his cancer.
The cigar was a solace. The cigar was something, when you suck, you've got something that you love. You've got the original source of nurturing when you suck. Now, Freud's analysis, which was a breakthrough, was limited. I think Freud's addiction was never analyzed, and it killed him.
By the 1920s, Sigmund Freud was a household name, the most famous psychiatrist in the world. His mystique was so great that a Chicago paper offered him $25,000 to psychoanalyze Leopold and Loeb, two wealthy teens who killed a friend for kicks. And Hollywood mogul Sam Goldwyn flew to Vienna in 1924 to offer Freud, the greatest love specialist in the world, in Goldwyn's words, $100,000 to consult on scripts.
Freud turned it down cold, made headlines. He just wasn't interested in that. But that shows you that Freud, in popular perception, was a mystical guru, a person who, in some special, fantastic way, knew the truths about human beings and could find out about people.
Not all human beings, as it turned out. One subject Freud never really understood was women, or as he called them, the dark continent. Freud posed a famous question: what do women want? But his own answers were dissatisfying and offensive.
The essential critique of Freud is that Freud thought that you were a superior human being if you had a penis and not if you didn't.
For women, the bedrock is their penis envy. Won't they always feel inferior because they lack this magnificent organ? There's a statement to the effect that a woman about the age of 30 is so rigid she can't change. Then, of course, there's a statement that a woman has a defective superego. I mean, where is the way out from this kind of a statement?
Freud, of course, didn't have much intimate contact with women. After his wife, he was closest to and increasingly dependent on his youngest daughter, Anna, who also became a psychoanalyst. Too close, perhaps. In 1918, Freud broke a psychoanalytic rule when he secretly began to analyze his daughter.
Freud psychoanalyzed his own daughter, which I see as a form of intellectual or emotional incest. She was his nurse, his secretary, his daughter. Certainly was as close a relationship between two human beings. There was no sex, so that was the only thing that there wasn't.
If you think that the goal of parenthood is to nurture a unique person and set them free, clearly that was not what happened in this relationship, because she remained very much his handmaiden, since he, by his own belief and theory, felt that sons wanted to kill their fathers and take their place. He created his successor in his daughter, by whom he must have been much less threatened.
When Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, Freud's worst fears about the dark forces of the unconscious were realized. Here was psychosis of the most extreme kind on a mass scale. Not surprisingly, Freud's books were among the first that Hitler burned.
What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Nowadays, they are content with burning my books.
One of those books was Freud's most recent and bleak, Civilization and Its Discontents. In it, he probed the psychic war between culture and barbarism.
The older Freud got, the more pessimistic he became, because all the things that he had hoped that the civilized restraints of society could bring about were now beginning to break down. In other words, animal man had organized himself in the form of these extreme political parties that were threatening to destroy the world.
Despite that threat, Freud was still able to take summer vacations in the Austrian countryside. His favorite pastimes were reading, playing with his dogs, and gathering flowers. On September 14, 1936, the Freuds celebrated their golden wedding anniversary. Now 80 years old, Freud was still very much the center and the head of his large and extended family.
We all were very close to him and depended on him very much. I mean, he was a provider in every way, you know, financially, spiritually. He was a provider. He was Moses.
On March 13, 1938, Germany annexed Austria, and Hitler marched into Vienna. Despite the growing danger, Freud refused to leave.
He thought that he could, you know, live out his life in Vienna, and that it would blow over. He had many friends in very high places, so he was very sheltered. I mean, he was the most sheltered Jew in Austria. And I don't exaggerate that.
Freud needed all the protection he could get. On March 14, 1938, Nazi thugs ransacked Bergasse 19 and made off with over $1,500. "I never got that much for a house call," Freud commented after they left. A week later, the Gestapo paid a visit and arrested Anna Freud, who spent a dangerous day at Gestapo headquarters. The top U.S. diplomat in Vienna cabled the White House. Fear Freud, despite age and illness, in danger. Finally, Freud agreed to leave.
He didn't want to leave, but then, fortunately, he saw the light of day and did leave. And it was Anna being held by the Gestapo for a day, which I think made him decide to leave.
On June 5th, Freud, Martha, and Anna left Vienna for Paris and eventually London. In reporting his departure, the Vienna papers referred to Freud's work as a pornographic Jewish specialty. Freud's 4 sisters were not permitted to leave. They died in concentration camps. Days before Freud escaped, photographer Edmund Engelmann spent a week at Bergasse 19 taking photographs.
I remember the terror on his face, how vulnerable he was, how afraid he was, and how fearful. And at one point I asked him to take his glasses off, and he gave me a little smile. I mean, it's really a faint smile. In these days, very few people did smile. Since I was there almost a week, I became like part of the family. And Mrs. Freud would take me around and show me the photographs of family members. Anna in particular was extremely depressed. She told me that she has discovered in people a new look, the refugee look.
In London, Freud himself now had the refugee look. Making matters worse, his cancer returned, and he underwent 2 operations in the winter of 1938. By now, his ideas about dreams, sexuality, and the unconscious had permeated Western culture, and yet Freud felt dissatisfied and unfulfilled. Psychoanalysis was still controversial, rejected by many as a true science.
He felt himself to have been the founder of a great science of psychoanalysis, and he had some bitterness of having had to fight for the acceptance of his ideas until his very old age.
Frail and dying, Freud continued to see patients and receive visitors. One visitor was the surrealist artist Salvador Dali, who used the occasion to make an interesting sketch. Freud celebrated his 83rd birthday, cigar in hand, on May 6, 1939. By mid-June, his cancer had become inoperable and his pain intense. Years before, Freud had made his daughter Anna promise that when the time comes, you won't let them torment me unnecessarily. On September 23, 1939, Freud told her that the time had come. He died that night from a lethal dose of morphine.
The doctor helped him to die peacefully, and it was a release for him. They couldn't operate anymore, you see.
Freud's ashes rest in an Etruscan vase from his collection of antiquities. He had always thought of himself as an archaeologist of the mind, digging old secrets out of the unconscious. Those secrets helped shape the consciousness of the 20th century, and they will no doubt continue to reverberate in the century ahead.
Toward the end of his life, Sigmund Freud came to regard psychoanalysis as a kind of promised land and himself as a kind of Moses. But he didn't believe that analysis could end human suffering or make people happy. Freud, student of the dark and blind forces of the psyche, was much too pessimistic for that. The most people could hope for, he said, was to exchange neurotic suffering for ordinary unhappiness.